Hello, welcome to the Defund 604 webinar on teach-in on immigration detention. And we're so happy that you can join us. If you require ASL interpretation, should be a link in the chat to a Zoom room where we have ASL interpreters. This teach-in is being live streamed on YouTube and being recorded, so people can watch it later as well, so you can share with your friends. I would like to invite Manuel Axel Strain, who is a non-binary two-spirit artist from the lands and waters of the Musqueam, Simk, and Silk peoples based in the sacred region of the Katzie and Kwantlen relatives. Here we go.
Siamna Siea Anta Suklast Anta Manuel Axel Strain Tenistna Musqueam Chuchua in Kamapalax and Amit Sabkakwilam. Isqui Manny. And so I just said, hello, everyone. Hi, Sepka. Thank you all for being here today. I introduced myself in a couple different ways. The first one was Suklest, and Suklest is my ancestral name. And it is the name of my great-great-grandfather, and I carry that name. And I'm very happy to share that with you today. I also said, welcome, welcome, welcome. And you can call me Manny as more informal. And yes, my father is from Musqueam, and he has a mother. My grandmother was Helen Point, and my great-grandparents were Tina Cole and Tony Point. And my mother is from Chuchua on her dad's side, my grandpa, and her mom was from Inkamapalax, which is a place name for the head of the Okanagan Lake. And that is where I am from in the Silks territory, in the Silks land. And I'm really grateful to be here. Haichka to Meenakshi for inviting me today, and for the people at Pivot Legal Society, who's situated within the unceded land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I was thinking a lot today about this, and when we're talking about detention centers, we're talking about a system within colonial law. And within Canada, the sovereign is the Queen still. And I think as a process of decolonization, which is rather tricky, which would be disruptive, would be to, and really one of the only ways to do it as a part of it, not the only way, but a part of it would be to recognize the sovereignty of the various Indigenous people within the nation. And I often call Canada a multinational country. It is a country with many nations. And so I would like to start by just inviting anyone here, if they know, if not, it's okay, we're all learning. If they know where they are, if they're not, where Pivot Legal Society is, maybe share where you are, the Indigenous traditional name. What is the place name of where you are, if you know it? And just share it in the chat for everyone. And I say that because it's really important that we recognize that sovereignty, because it would radically change our world in a really beneficial way, I think. I have been taught that I don't own the land, that it owns us. And we see that here in British Columbia. We see that here recently when we have forest fires, we have floods. We see that we don't own that. You know, it can just come in and disrupt us when it's upset. And it is also through this idea of private property that erases that governance system. Not only does it erase that, it erases people. It erases many peoples, not just us. It erases so many. And when we would create our relatives, the land, our plant relatives, and we treat them as property, like they're less than, then we people go into treating humans like that too, which is where we have slavery. And then that leads into prisons. And I just want to tell everyone that that's not our way. Within this place, this multinational country we call Canada, that's not how we've always done things. We've welcomed people here because we recognize that we don't own this land, that it owns us. And I just want to reiterate that you are welcome here. For me and my family, I can say that. And that if we had sovereignty, this wouldn't be the way that it happened. That if the Queen was not the sovereign, and if the real people from here were the sovereigns, we wouldn't be in this situation. We wouldn't have these, these systems that are hurting people and that are hurting people's minds and their spirits and their hearts. And I also think that everything is connected. And so I'm not surprised that at this moment in time where we have this climate crisis, we also have a drug poisoning crisis, people dying of overdoses. We have people being, murdered for their mental health, where we have people that suffer with mental health. I think before settler colonialism, there wasn't a word in our languages for depression. We knew how to take care of each other. We knew how to love each other. And my mom also taught me from a very young age. She said there will be a time when Indigenous people will need to help others, and we will need to teach them. And it was like a prophecy to her. I was like 6 years old, and she said the world will get bad, but we will be there to help others. And I believe we're in that time. And so I'm really grateful to be here. I want everyone to remember that this isn't our way. This is not an Indigenous way of doing things, to have detention centers, to have prison. And we must work on dismantling that system as a vital process of decolonization. And so again, I'd say Haitsepka. Thank you to you all. And I guess that's it.
Thank you so much, Manny, for welcoming us and providing, drawing those connections. My name is Omar. I'm calling in from the territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, which lies within the shared territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Musqueam, Cookite, Squamish, and Stolo nations. And I am a member of the Defund 604 network. The Defund 604 network opposes all forms of detention, including immigration detention. And here in this province known as British Columbia, on average, over 1,600 people are annually held in immigration detention in BC. And although numbers dropped due to COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021, over 300 people were still detained in the province. There's no time limit on immigration detention, which means that as long as detained migrants are provided with monthly review hearings, it is legal to hold them indefinitely. And legal isn't just, for sure. And we're fighting to end immigration detention. I would like to invite Suhail Ben Sliman to speak next. Suhail is a parent, a widely beloved member of our community, a very active and generous volunteer for social causes, and a human rights advocate and coordinator of the Jail Accountability and Information Line in Ottawa, in occupied, unceded, and unsurrendered Algonquin territory.
Thank you so much, Omar, for letting me speak and for inviting us. Thank you, Minachi, and all the folks from Defund for inviting us to this panel. Thank you, Manny, for welcoming us and for sharing those words of wisdom with us. It's truly appreciated. I'm speaking to you right now. We are passing through Tyendinaga Mohawk territory and to Algonquin, unceded and surrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. And this, knowing the land and the people who exist on the land is very important, given, the histories of these lands and the peoples who, the keepers of these lands since time immemorial, because, they are, first of all, the people of the land, but also they are under constant attacks of settler Canadian colonialism, which operates in various ways. And one of the ways in which this nationalism and settler colonialism works is through these nationalist kind of divisions of the world, like to borders and otherwise. And we see that the Canadian government uses borders not only to keep immigrants out, or to, but also to, demarcate indigenous territories, unjustly so, in a very colonial and violent way. And borders have been used to, to divide people, to the people who should be together, struggling together, living together, breathing together, sharing together, healing each other, tending to each other, tending to the land. But instead of that, we have these laws that are put in place that divide us, and and continues this genocidal colonial project of apartheid against indigenous peoples, against people of African descent. And that those tools that were created, in the beginning to enact this settler colonialism on Ontario Island, are later on used on people who have different, oppressed identities. And one of those groups is immigrants. Racialized immigrants who are moving through the land and through space. And I came here with my parents, when I was 16, as a landed immigrant to this country. And after that, I started becoming, involved in certain activities or behaviors that are just criminalized. Things that the youth do when they're young, whether it be like smoking weed or trying to get something because their parents are immigrants and cannot afford it. We come from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. Sometimes we have to steal and do things like that in order for us to survive under this capitalist world. But we get criminalized sometimes at a very young age. I was there with friends who were Somali or Iraqi that have been in Canada as refugees since their tender childhoods, and they later on got deported to Somalia, to a land that they never really lived in. They've been here since youth, and in the same boat, I got criminalized. And CBSA came to see me one morning when I was serving time on pre-trial custody for some charges, and they deported me for a drug trafficking charge. But the government is selling drugs every day. Why don't they deport themselves then? If they're going to deport people for doing things that they need to while they're doing the same thing. Like their system is like a hypocrisy in which like people are targeted for acts that are valorized by like whiteness. You know, like now we see like a lot of people, for example, a lot of white folks like making a lot of money from selling weed, you know, and we used to get criminalized for doing that. People now are getting billions from doing that stuff, right? And after I got released, I used to be like on a pass system, you know, like a pass system that similar, like basically like in order for me to travel just like outside of the boundaries of Ottawa or just or of Gatineau in the beginning, like just to go to Ottawa, I had to get like a paper from my parole officer just to travel across there. So I had the surveillance from the parole board of Canada and you know, the parole officers in CSC, and I also have the surveillance that is you know, enacted by CBSA. And I have to go sign in every week since 2018. When I came out, I've been signing in every week at the CBSA offices in Ottawa, and I think that's very unjust and unfair because a simple conditions, just like going to an office on a day, might seem like a simple thing, but these are very violent tools of domination because they coerce people into doing things, into going places. They coerce people into forcible confinement. They coerce people into, you know, bringing their body physically or talking on the phone as like as a way of like expansive or extended surveillance or electronic surveillance on our communities and people. So I don't want to come sign in every week, but I have no choice because like I'm on deportation and the conditions that I'm outside on is that like if they want to deport me, I have to surrender myself to CBSA immediately in order for them to like be able to deport me. But I've been living here for most of my life. I have a child here who's 12 years old. I have family and friends who are here. And yeah, so it's just, it's an unfair system. First of all, who are these colonizers to tell people who should and shouldn't be on stolen land? I know my Algonquin friends, they have no issue with me staying here on their territory, but the government, you know, doesn't care about the sovereignty of indigenous peoples, or just doesn't care about people in general. And we're disposable and we have no say into the system. And a lot of us are spending years behind bars in immigration detention. I was lucky. I didn't spend years behind bars in immigration detention. I got out pretty much like right away after my second bail hearing. But I know friends that go in front of the, you know, the bail system week after week after week. And in so-called Canada, we have an immigration bail system that actually works differently than the criminal bail system. Criminal bail system, they have to prove why they have to keep you there. While in the immigration bail system, you have to prove what's changed now. Why can we release you? Why should we release you, right? And like that kind of put the onus on the person who is going through the bail hearing instead of putting the onus on the state to prove that. And like after a few bail hearings, the chances, statistically speaking, even the chances of people getting bail become like slim or next to nothing. So again, people come back there every month hoping that they will get bail, they get reunited with their family. But what happens is that they stay in jail. And you know, I would like to also stress that the system, the current system we have here, and today is important to speak about that because it's Nakba Day, and the Palestinian since 1948, so 74 years of Nakba, which is the great catastrophe in which Israeli, you know, settler colonizers took over lands on Palestine and kicked Palestinians out of their homes in a very, you know, violent act and an ongoing act. So it is, we talk about you know, Palestinians and the plight they're facing at the hands of the Zionist settler colonizers as like an apartheid regime in which part of the population is subject to a differential and a different treatment and a different set of laws and rules that like regulate their life and stuff like that. But we have to also think about the immigration system here in so-called Canada as another apartheid regime. There's apartheid regimes here that are deployed against Indigenous people, against people of African descent and such. And those, there's another one, there's the immigration system, which subjects immigrants to a different set of rules and of laws. I'll give you an example. People who have, citizenship, like quote unquote, this colonial fake document that they dispense to whoever fits within their categories of like, acceptedness, of, respectability, of, docile, like, I'm not talking shit about anyone. I'm just saying, like, that's how the state, I think, looks at people. But us, when we are found guilty of the same acts, not only that we're punished by incarceration, but we are doubly punished by deportation. So after we finish our times, we're still facing deportation to another lands where we didn't exist. Lands where, for example, me as a non-binary queer person, I might get like violated and killed, and whatever happens to me if I get deported to so-called Morocco. But we're still separating families. The state is separating families, is letting families in prisons. They are actually, like, in Canada, they're this veneer, this Canadian veneer, is like so pervasive that they are trying to mask and like dissimulate this like immigration detention here, and they say like inside of it, outside is gonna look like a daycare, blah blah blah. They're gonna make this like the bars are not gonna be, I don't know, like are not gonna be like perpendicular. They're gonna be parallel or something like that. You know what I mean? Like it's not about the aesthetics of the jail. It's not about the ways in which like coercion is made. Because even if you bring a red carpet inside, the jail remains a jail. Lifers, friends of mine, when I used to do time with them in the pen, I tell them, it's a nice place. We have a little bit more access to whatever, like a stove or something like that. And they remind me, like they'll be like, don't forget, jail is a jail. Like it doesn't matter if they have, stoves and ovens and we have more access or whatever. We're still separated from our families. But also want to highlight quickly how like also surveillance is pervasive in our community, and that like the so-called alternatives to detention, when it's state-driven, it is not alternatives to detention. It's just basically like surveillance expanding into our communities through like bracelet electronic monitoring devices, GPS tracking, phone check-ins, and like tower, phone tower, surveillance and otherwise. And those experiences are experienced by people who go through them as punishment. So we have a punishment system that is live and well, and that is like creating a lot of victims, not only human victims, but that is also ripping lands apart that, should remain whole, just like the people who exist upon them. And this fake regime and this normalized, global regime of terror on people, this normalized warfare that is waging people should not stay normal to people, because we have to get rid of this system. We know the roots. We know the roots of the system. We know the violent, we know the toxic roots of this system, but we have to get rid of it all. People around us, they show us that there's other ways to relate to each other, to relate to the land that we exist upon, and that we find ourselves in, and that we are displaced towards, or that we exist as guests or as settlers, or as other people in this land. There is other ways we can relate to each other. And the only real radical things we're asking for is that we get rid of this violence. We just want to live in violence-free futures where people can move, can like leave, can return, and can stay. Like no one is illegal. Have been advocating for quite a number of years. We just want to live in those kind of ways. And I'm gonna cede the floor to other folks. Thank you for having me. If there's any questions, please feel free.
Thank you so much, Suhail. My name is Minakshi. I'm one of the co-facilitators, and I just want to say big thanks to Manny for welcoming us to this territory, for centering us in the Indigenous people's relationship to this land and the Musqueam people's relationship to the land that I reside on, and an acknowledgement that incarceration and detention are not the ways of these territories, and they're not the ways of the people who are the rightful stewards of this land. Also, really want to thank Suhail for sharing their experience and their analysis of the system and making really important connections, including to global apartheid regimes like the Israeli state, and acknowledging that today is Nakba 74. Folks can follow Suhail's ongoing work and the fight to keep them in this so-called country. You can just search hashtag Keep Suhail Home, and the link has been shared in the YouTube chat as well. The next speaker that we have joining us today is Keon Farrell, and it's my pleasure to introduce Keon. Keon is an artist, writer, and organizer. He's one of the founding members of the Migrant Detainee Support Coalition, aka MIDISUCO, formerly known as the Toronto Organizing Committee. He's the author of number 1000336145, which is a collection of poems first published in 2016. And he's exhibited an installation of the same title at the Land exhibit as part of Own the Walls, which was a BIPOC youth art initiative. Keon has also performed at the Pride Toronto Youth Stage in 2017 for supporting our youth, and his work has appeared in Refugee Tales 4, which is a UK anthology about multiple refugee experiences with different immigration systems across the world. Keon grew up in the West End of Toronto, loves food and loves different cuisine. So I love that. And also a good reminder to me that we, Defund 604, are also selling Keon's zine as a fundraiser. If you're interested in purchasing the zine that I mentioned, just send an email to info@defund604.org so Keon can get all the different kind of food he likes. He listens to R&B and EDM, and he's currently organizing with the Toronto Prisoner Rights Project to bring greater community awareness to the struggle behind bars that former and current prisoners face. So welcome, Keon, and thanks for sharing some wisdom with us today.
Thank you for having me. Hi, my name is Keon Farrell, and I'd like to say that I'm currently speaking from the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River land is a territory that I speak from. I just wanted, before I continue, I would like to definitely take a moment to share some of my poetry with folks. So I'll take a moment to do that. So this poem title is Come Down From There. Come down from there. You can't keep that to yourself. Your heart isn't meant for a shelf, for there's other hearts, another heart just for you. But what about the other heart, watching my heart for a sign from the other shelf in the window? Was my placement, my heart, truly alone? I can't keep my heart to myself, but whose is it I shall share this heart with? Confusion, care, for, be there, for once attached, where you go, I'll follow. As an individual heart, I am worried to call another heart home. So that is Come Down From There. I also like to share memories is an individual's greatest weapon. Memory is an individual's greatest weapon. Memories are a personal and unique component to life as our thoughts travel through realms of one memory plane of a despairful event. It's fundamentally expressed, our environment shapes us. I greatly emphasize it's our recollection of events that compounds and tailors an individual's environment for memories. Your memory is a weapon consistently deployed against you. Weapon, consistently deployed against the private and public sectors, against immigrants who make up and are comprised of these sectors, against immigrants and detainees who bleed through their labor to manufacture these sectors. Our memories are preyed upon and reshaped for political gain through resentment, exploitation, extraction, and displacement, because our memories are fickle. Excuse. It's socially easier to digest institutional thought than to challenge and deconstruct the systemic views intended for thought. As humans, our memories are our greatest asset of mass destruction, for they build us and break us down and amplify through the night when isolated and confined to a realm, a space composed of solid material, steel, and concrete. This is not a memory. This is my reality. Detained, I am. What does your memory mean to you when it's not your own? Because you cannot remember. For every memory is the same, concrete. I read these poems that I just shared because they were created while I was incarcerated on immigration detention. While I was in immigration detention for 3 years, I was detained in the Central East Correctional Maximum Facility in Lindsay, Ontario. While I was there, I faced multiple hardships, just like everyone else that was around me, seeing families broken and disenfranchised from each other, it's ripped away from their communities, deported. But before I go further, I'd like to speak about a few slides that I have. This is the first slide. Next slide. So I'd like to talk about the criminalization, the crimmigration, which is people have always migrated, whether in search of better lives to reunite with families or because they are forced out of their homes. We have entered into an era in which migration has been criminalized. So essentially, when you look at the climate crisis that's taking place, how many folks are going to be displaced from the climate crisis? So how many of those folks are going to be locked up somewhere around the world for crimmigration? Next slide. What is immigration detention? Well, immigration detention in Canada is the arbitrary and indefinite detention of undocumented migrants. These migrants have no charges against them and no trial forthcoming. Hundreds are held in maximum security prisons. I, along with multiple other immigration detainees, were held in maximum security prisons, a relationship that is pretty cozy for the provincial government and federal government, but which should be disbanded, or it should be not permitted, considering the harms that it causes and the fact that you're holding individuals in maximum security prisons. Maximum security prisons shouldn't exist in the first place, but furthermore, it's even more compounded when you have individuals on civil offenses being held in these maximum security institutions. Definitely shouldn't exist. Next slide. What is indefinite detention? Detainees are not told how long they will be held for, and there is no limit to their detention, which means this situation can be described as indefinite detention. So without having a time limit for your actual immigration stay or how long you're going to be held in custody for, you're essentially just left up to just wonder when you'll be released without any actual defined date, or even in a sentence, perhaps you have your set release date. But for immigration detention, definite detention, you don't have a release date. You're pretty much just set to whenever the bureaucracy gets around to you and they decide to either deport you or release you, then you have a date. but until then, you're essentially left indefinite detention. Furthermore, immigration detention in Canada has no maximum period of detention set out in law. In many cases, this leads to situations of long-term detention for migrants. In particular, migrants who are detained pending deportation can be held for years while authorities attempt to arrange deportation to countries that may not be willing to issue travel documents. So you can be sitting down while being detained for indefinite detention while in custody when Canada's trying to speak with your home country to try to deport you. You're being held, even though your home country in Canada is fully aware your home country is not going to provide travel documents. You now become a long-term detainee, and the amount of visits that you receive on updates on your case is pretty slim. You don't really get a lot of information because you're considered a long-term detainee, which is out of the ordinary it's unordinary that you receive regular updates. But indefinite detention in Canada is definitely problematic. Incarceration as a whole is problematic. Next slide, please. Double punishment. Detainees who are convicted of a crime have already served their jail sentences. Facing deportation or indefinite detention for a crime for which they have already served the sentence is unjust and double punishment. So pretty much to be detained for serving a criminal sentence and then to be detained once again after you served your sentence, you're now being held for the same offense. You're now being penalized for the same offense, which is bullshit, to be quite honest. But with that being said, I'd like to speak about organizing on the inside. So organizing on the inside is definitely a vital, and it's something that's taken place where I've seen individuals lay their lives on the line or lay their bodies on the line, such as for multiple hunger strikes in order to gain awareness, since our daily living activities and daily structure was non-existent to actually. So organizing on the inside is definitely very, very important. And it's just ordinary folks, migrants who are putting themselves at risk. Even though like right now when I'm speaking when there's a high possibility of risk of repercussions for speaking out, knowing that my matter is still ongoing. But with that being said, I still think it's very important and very vital to share, firsthand experience of what's taking place and what's happening. And right now there's multiple individuals who are being locked down and they don't have access to regular telephone access to call their family. They're displaced. They're being held in institutions that are miles away from their communities. So one, you can't have any visitation because of COVID. And before COVID, due to the length of distance from the institutions to the home locations of where migrants may have family or supports systems located, while you're pretty much displaced from your support networks and you no longer have regular access. But with that being said, it's definitely hard and it's difficult. But thank you for having me. My name is Keon Farrell, and If you have any questions or thoughts, please. Thank you. Just leave a comments.
Thank you so much, Keon, for speaking honestly and bravely. Next up, we're going to show a video from Bryant, who's also known as Higher Knowledge. And Bryant's going to talk and also perform.
What's up, everybody? Yektunao, Naha Nutukai, Bryant, HK. Hello, everyone. Good day. Good sun. My name is Bryant, or HK, as I'm known in the artist community. I am, an indigenous artist, locally from, these Coast Salish, these beautiful Coast Salish territories. I reside, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Ancestrally, I am from Central and South America. On my paternal side, I am Nawa Pipil from Cuscatan, which is in El Salvador, and Mestizo from Colaseyu in what is now known as Chile. I also have ancestral roots to Romania and Spain. And yeah, but I've been living up here with my northern cousins for some time now, and very, very appreciative of Defund 604 and the other organizers for inviting me to this very important event. This is actually something that's very close to my heart on multiple levels. But I'm going to share a piece that I think is very relevant, and then maybe deconstruct it a little bit, because that's going to really go and co-align with, I think, what I'm trying to say and what this whole thing is about. So, yeah. They say I'm Spanish. I say I'm damaged. My roots have vanished, just like Atlantis, just like my aunts did. Don't know where my land is, maybe that's why they say I'm outlandish. My only ties to Spain is the pain inside of its name, inside of my veins, violence and rage, jaguars who are trying to be tamed, economics and profits that all supply by the cane, a land split by invisible lines that were placed, islands remain in a spirits which coincide with the space, or lives displaced, fed the lies and the hate, the aura of diaspora that I'm trying to break. See the brushing with northern cousins that remind me to make journeys to homelands where my sacred fire is placed, forged in fire to face what colonizers have made. Indigenous and an immigrant, who am I in this place? Am I in this place? I said, am I in this place? Identities of Incas, Aztecs, and Mayas erased. It's time for different tribes to relate, unite for the strength, reclamation of 7 nations these rhymes can create. Yeah, so, this piece I've written, all my piece, everything I write comes from my experiences, things that I experience personally or witness or just going through in different ways, or attached to or connected to in different ways. And, this is something growing up that's been a very tumultuous and arduous process of understanding my own identity, especially in correlation to, the communities up here, just the general Canadian communities, but the Indigenous communities as well, and my own Indigenous communities, and how all those things intersect. And so, I just identified as Hispanic or Latino growing up, and grew up in foster care and entrenched, in the streets and bouncing around group homes and in and out of jail and all that stuff. And then, came to a place where I start kind of, because I grew up with the Indigenous community here, right? you know, a lot of inner city urban natives, you know, in East Van, in Surrey, and started to contemplate, like, what does it mean to be Latino? Like, what does that even mean? What does it mean to be Hispanic? I just didn't even know. I always identified with the indigenous community here more because that's who I grew up with, right? And then as, you know, as I got older and started going on my healing journey and meeting, you know, older indigenous folks who had been on their healing journey as well, they started to teach me about the, you know, that word decolonizing and going back to my roots, and then met some Nawa people from my territories who, you know, coupled with the other indigenous folks teaching me about decolonizing, helped reconnect me to my own indigenous roots and understand that, you know, when Latinos call themselves Spanish or Hispanic or anything like that, like, that is a very limited part of our story. It's perpetuated through internalized racism and colonization, you know, and you know, I started to learn about, you know, the histories in Cuscatan and in El Salvador, and how, you know, we just come from so much civil war. And, you know, in the 1930s, there was a giant massacre in El Salvador in my grandparents' generation, where they murdered like 40,000 indigenous people in a very, very short amount of time. Like, entire villages murdered, men, women, children murdered. They had mass graves, and it had left an ongoing fear and trauma where no one even wanted to identify as indigenous. And it actually goes older than that. You know, it goes way more back to 500 years to since, you know, Christopher Columbus came here with the first conquistadors, right? So that was my journey, understanding that. And then coming up here, it's like, okay, well, technically I'm an immigrant, because I wasn't even born in Canada. I was actually born in LA, and my family was fleeing civil war, you know. And then we came to Vancouver. You know, I have my landing papers, and it's just this weird intersect of being an immigrant and indigenous at the same time. And what does that mean? And I realized that this is all products of colonization, because I talked to many people about the ancient trade routes we used to have from north to south, you know, and these borders and boundaries that have been made by these so-called, you know, countries, which are really just corporations, right? It's just a big business. You know, they're very new, right? And that they don't define who we actually are. And so we gotta reach back to understand that, right? So when you have, going back to the topic of these detention centers, a lot of them are actually jailing indigenous people, sometimes who are on their traditional territories, like down south in the States, where you have all these Mexican immigrants, you know, called border jumpers, and being arrested by ICE and put in these facilities. And it's like, a lot of these people are on their traditional indigenous territories that they've been on for thousands and thousands of years. And in the recent history, you know, the states put this border and said, no, then now you're a border jumper. Like, this shit is crazy to me, right? So yeah, there's no right for people to be doing that. You know, I remember coming back from LA, and you know, one of the most racist things, the most visually racist things I ever seen, was coming off from the plane, and there was this kind of Y. I'm walking, and it's literally, to the left is to leave the airport, and to the right is to get secondary screened, where they start grilling you and going through all your stuff, and what are you doing here, and blah blah blah, right, from the immigration people. And it was literally like white person, white person, white person, brown person, brown person, white person, white person, brown person, brown person. It was one of the most visually racist things that I just seen so jarringly in front of my face. And of course I get secondary screen too. It's all very triggering and terrible. Yeah, so it needs to stop, and thank you, Defund 604 and the other folks for putting this on. And
Thanks so much to HK for that. Next up, we have Ish Adiranmu, who is a writer, law student, and maker of #GoodTrouble. Ish has been recognized for his leadership acumen and potential for leadership and voice around traditional and non-traditional tables of influence in Canada. Ish believes that deeply personal stories can communicate a vision and a picture of the realities people face. These visions, as enablers of action, can be a helpful tool for social and political change. This is beautifully articulated in his award-winning piece, They Called Me Prisoner 183645, which received gold at the National Magazine Award 2021. Ish has been featured in numerous national media outlets, including the Toronto Star, Global News, CBC, and Toronto Life.
Thank you for that welcome, Omar. Thank you, Manny, for the wonderful welcome. Keon, I appreciate your comments. Suhail, it was great to hear sort of your unique perspective. Some of the things you both said got me riled up as someone who's spent some time in an immigration detention center. But I'm going to just, I think I'm going to center the few minutes I have on immigration detention and sort of how, capitalism in the prison industrial context, played a role in that in my own experience. So I'll just take you back to sort of a little bit about me. I migrated to Canada as a young kid with my family at the age of 3. We eventually became Canadian citizens here and moved to the United States. I got into the cannabis business a little early, some would say. And so that ended up having quite the ramifications. And I remember Keon talked about double punishment. So I, sort of did my time for that, for that charge. I've been living in the United States for 15 years, and there, sort of out of nowhere came this other consequence, right? That meant that I had to fight deportation out of nowhere without even knowing. And one of the things that I found fascinating about just spending time in an ICE detention center is one, I was living in Philadelphia and they put you like 400 kilometers away, so very far from family support, all of that thing. 2, the actual immigration detention centers themselves are embedded inside of, max and medium security prisons. And what sort of makes that happen, or the engine driving behind that, is you have a lot of small towns that used to rely on some sort of coal or something like that, and there are no longer coal jobs, and so the U.S. federal government says we'll give you X amount per bed, just build up as many detention centers as you can. And so so that's sort of like one thing that I can share. And then the other is indefinite detention is one of the things that I found the most distressing. For example, like a good example is, where you are from a country where, they won't supply travel documents, for example. The indifference to by like administrative law and immigration law and the tribunal to that plight is wild. Like they'll certainly say there's this thing sort of called habeas corpus where you can't be held indefinitely. But I can tell from experience there were people that have been held for 3, 4, 5 years simply because they were from say Liberia, for example, or South Sudan, that wasn't at the time issuing travel documents. And I was actually able to trace the reason that what triggered my deportation back to a 1993 crime bill that Bill Clinton, and it's just this arbitrary thing, right, that just makes selling weed an aggravated felony, and so therefore you are treated like absolute garbage for it. So we're just gonna take me to like I wrote a piece for 420, and I'm just gonna read it and share it with you. This is 420 is one of these things that is this lovely holiday for the people making a lot of loot off of weed now. Whereas, I was an enterprising weed supplier, and the amount of collateral consequences of having a felony conviction, they just like pop up every day. So I'm going to get started. Imagine sitting in a cell for years, decades, or even life, convicted of an activity that is no longer a crime, while thousands of other people build intergenerational wealth doing the exactly same thing. That is the situation that over 40,000 cannabis prisoners face today in the United States alone. The numbers in Canada, like, they just won't give them to you. I've been looking. Every day in prison, the message implicitly and explicitly is that you're a worthless piece of garbage. And I think one of the hardest experiences to appreciate is the person's exposure to trauma during their time in the criminal legal system, whether or not that's like 2 weeks pre-trial, 3 months, 3 years. Because the moment you are charged with the crime, you enter into the jail system and you're just not a human being. And anything that is done to you or not done for you is justified because you're just not a human being. I think often most people think of criminal punishment as the moment it's meted out, right? So in my case, it would have been, here's your sentence for possession with intent to deliver 10 pounds of pot. But, punishment actually carries like with you through your life, right? Including, after, sort of finishing my sentence and minding my business, having a job, being approached by two, ICE agents randomly and being sort of ripped away from the life that I had in the States. I'd lived there for 15 years, and this was the only, sort of issue that I had. But yeah, no, the collateral consequences are just like, there's thousands, right? Like a few would be housing, banking, even if they don't really say it in banking, employment, education, which I could talk about all day. But then even like, I'll tell you one that happened recently. I've been using Airbnb for 10 years or so. It's a very seemingly friction-free way to book a place. And I think this was like a few weeks ago, tried to book an Airbnb, and they did a criminal record check, and they were like, no, sorry, your account's deleted. You have no recourse, and they sort of tell you, where and why your account's being deleted. And it came down to this, drug trafficking charge that I pled guilty to back in 2012. So again, I think the term I use, it's just everything's arbitrary, right? Like Airbnb is based in California, weed's been legal there, but they're totally cool with like just having this like violent sort of policy that doesn't, it doesn't make anyone safer anyway. So there's that. The other piece I wanted to talk about is private prisons and their role in immigration detention centers. I'm gonna probably leave it here, but what I want you to think about is the fact that there are private prisons that are trading on the Wall Street Stock Exchange, and their stock goes up and down based on the number of beds that are filled inside of a private prison. And so if that isn't the definition of a fucking sick society, I don't know what is. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ish. That absolutely is the definition of a sick society. to commodify prisoners and profit off of them. And I really want to appreciate how Ish, Suhail, Keon have like made some really important connections around the ways that drug law enforcement, colonialism, and we even saw in HK's video, like these are interrelated systems. And while today we're talking about ending immigration detention, we really are more broadly calling for the abolition of all prisons and forms of carceral geography. So our next speaker today is Dr. Elle Jones, and it's my pleasure to introduce her. She's a poet, journalist, professor, and abolitionist who is living in Jabuktuk, aka Halifax, Nova Scotia. Dr. Elle Jones was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax and has won 2 Atlantic Journalism Gold Awards in 2018 and 2019. She was also the 2016 recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her work with prisoners. She was the 15th Nancy's Chair in Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University, and received her PhD in Cultural Studies at Queen's University and is an assistant professor in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. I know that's a really embarrassing bio, but I think you're brilliant and wanted to read it all out. So I'm gonna spotlight Elle for everyone joining in.
Thank you, Minachi, and thank you, everybody. I'm sorry, I have COVID, so you can hear it in my voice. And because I have COVID, I feel like I can't think, so I'm going to be a nerd and put on a PowerPoint. So here we go. Just really briefly. The first thing I want to say, sorry, I don't know how to use PowerPoint despite using it every day. Slideshow. That's that one. Okay. Hi, everybody. I am here in Jabuktuk, Halifax, on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people. Because I have COVID, I was unable to attend today the remembrance of the Nakba, and also, of course, for the journalist Shireen Abu Akba, who was shot by Israeli forces as well. And that is very connected to, of course, what we are talking about today, as Suhail and others have mentioned, that this has everything to do with the global structures of detention. We know that technologies are shared, both, of course, literal technologies and, of course, the human technologies of detention are shared around the world. HP, for example, which is manufactured and gives money to Israel, also is used to track immigrants in the Americas as well. So when we look at what's happening in Israel-Palestine, we recognize that those techniques of colonialism are exported around the world and then imported back. And so the very same techniques on the West Bank and Gaza are also being used inside Canadian prisons and outside of Canadian prisons to criminalize, survey, and track people. So we make those important links and understand that many of our corporations are invested into these structures of criminalization and policing. Sorry for my voice. Very briefly, and I am going to do a poem at the end, but very quickly, I wanted to say that, of course, migration and borders are an issue of reproductive justice. With the leak of Roe versus Wade in the States, many people have been, of course, looking at that, and then the discussion about our abortion rights under threat in Canada. And of course, many people are saying, we shouldn't act like we are at the same threat of the state because abortion is safe and supported in Canada. But of course, people who do not have access to abortion very much include those who are migrants, people who are working here on migrant worker that have no access to healthcare. If you are, of course, targeted for deportation and lose access to healthcare, then you lose access to all kinds of services, which would include abortion services as well. So on that basic level, we recognize that, of course, not all people in Canada, certainly by any means, have access to safe and accessible abortions. But beyond that, it's also more broadly connected to these ideas of policing and containment and whose bodies are under control. So we can't talk about my body, my choice, the beloved kind of like liberal slogan, without recognizing the many, many ways that extends. Also, of course, to trans people, some of whom, trans and non-binary people, also seek abortions and need abortions, but also more broadly into the control of bodies, which includes people's movements across this globe, particularly from the south into the north. It includes the policing of whose bodies should reproduce and whose bodies can labor. All of that is connected to the ultimate reproductive control that is about controlling access to future workers, capitalism's future, and of course, controlling women, trans men, and non-binary people, people who have a uterus's ability to make choices about how we bring those future workers into being. So this slide, very briefly, just to remind us all, this is a slide from a couple of years ago. A headline from a couple of years ago. ICE detainees' alleged hysterectomies recall a long history of forced sterilization. So this is in response to a story where a doctor whistle blew that women inside ICE facilities were being given sterilized, like given forcible hysterectomies. And that, of course, very much ties to the history of sterilizing Indigenous women in Canada, well into the 70s, and in fact, well into now. Like, this isn't ancient history. There's a current lawsuit by Indigenous women in Canada who were forcibly and unknowingly sterilized by the state, and often, again, tied to histories of movement. So many girls that are runaways, for example, were targeted and put into institutions, criminalized, and then targeted for sterilization as well. So we recognize again that fundamentally the control of people's movement, the control of access to land and resources, it also underlies reproductive justice, underlies the control of migration as well. So just to remind us that from this slide as well. This is a woodcut from enslavement, and of course depicts family separation. And this is just to remind us as well that through the child welfare system and crimmigration system, it is hard to say, Keon, it's so hard to say. Keon was struggling, and I'm like, yeah, crimmigration is not easy to say. So through the contemporary crimmigration system, we're all struggling. The deportation system that separates families. This is still ongoing today and continues to largely target Indigenous people through the child welfare system and Black people both through the child welfare system and overwhelmingly through who is targeted for deportation. So Haitians, Somalis, Nigerians, Jamaicans are overwhelmingly targeted in our system and criminalized. So this is just a woodcut depicting that. Very briefly as well, people may be familiar with the story of Fatuma Abdi, the sister of Abdul Abdi. We talked a bit about child welfare, and that shows again the connections within the system. Abdul and Fatuma were both taken into the child welfare system as children who were refugees. They were not given a translator, and they were rapidly taken into a foster system and made wards of the state. That meant, of course, that the province stood as their parent. They did not seek citizenship on behalf of the children, even though doing so denied them the most fundamental basic rights. We often talk about Abdul's story because Abdul's story was the sort of famous story. This is a story we did advocacy on, led by Fatuma. Abdul had been bounced to 31 different homes, including group homes, youth detention, showing how all these systems intersect before at the age of 19, being targeted for deportation back to Somalia, where he nor his sister had ever lived. Both of them had been forcibly stripped of their language and culture when they entered group homes. Fatuma had had her hijab stripped from her head and never given another one. So Abdul's case came as a piece of national advocacy, but many people don't know the story of Fatuma, who in this picture, what you can't see is she's standing up to Justin Trudeau. It's just a bad angle on the slide. She's standing about 100 meters from, not even from Justin Trudeau, 100 feet maybe, and asking him about the deportation of her brother and asking him if he would deport his own child. And she was 6 months pregnant at the time on a quite high-risk pregnancy. She had children killed by the child welfare system. Her home was raided after Abdul was arrested, and they took her child into child welfare, repeating this generational trauma. And then her child, who was living with severe disabilities, actually died in foster care despite her pleas for the child to receive medical attention. And I want to say this clearly, the child never received a headstone. So they never even let Fatuma know where her child is buried. And this shows the violence of this system. And again, that as people rally for abortion and reproductive rights, let us remember that so often this deportation immigration system entirely targets things like families, splits into the child welfare system. People like Fatuma who are pregnant are being threatened by CBSA agents with deportation as she was pregnant, and also mourning a child and trying to save her brother as well. So we can remember that as well within, as we think about this. This is a defunding seminar. I know it's Defund 604, and then we're talking about immigration and deportation within that. So just a reminder to us that policing takes many forms. Policing is not just the boys in blue. it also includes border policing. CBSA is the only police force in Canada that has absolutely no independent oversight. None of them are effective, of course. I'm not shouting out here to like SIU or CERT or whatever you have in your place. We're useless, but at least there's something. CBSA has absolutely nothing. If you make a complaint, it goes to the officer himself. And this also includes, of course, CBSA stationed at foreign ports around the world. So CBSA does stuff like illegally put up billboards telling people not to bother immigrating to Canada. They particularly target Romani people, what is racistly known as gypsies, the Roma people, who have been dislocated within Europe for thousands of years. Canada actively discourages migration and immigration and refugee status and illegally tells people like not to get on boats or planes. They've also done this in Nigeria. Canada actually has a long history of this, of historical campaigns to tell Black people not to come to Canada as well. And all of this is unregulated. You can't complain. There is no way. We don't know the stats on who's in immigration detention. If somebody dies in immigration detention, it's extraordinarily hard to even get an investigation or get a name or even figure out that it happened. So we understand that this is part of our fight of policing, also has to include the policing of borders. CBSA, by the way, also is completely unregulated in their use of force. They love to get strapped up and come to your home. They have long histories of busting in apartments on like routine checkups to terrify children. A friend of mine who's dying of cancer, who is scheduled for deportation, CBSA regularly comes to his apartment to just intimidate him as he's dying. He's also, of course, denied healthcare, and we have to fight for that. So in Canada, that claims that healthcare is available for everybody, it is not available for all people. I'll keep moving. This slide it has a quote from Saidiya Hartman, which suggests that Black people only enter our frame when we can be criminalized. In other words, we stay invisible until we can be put in a prison or deported. But this is just to remind us of these links, which Manny, for example, really beautifully articulated between enslavement, residential schools, and our ongoing forms of state-controlled family separation as well. And finally, no, it's not finally, I just remind us as well as the door of no return. So the door of no return, which is the gate out of which, the places out of which African enslaved people were captured and taken into the Americas, and remains a kind of ancestral memory in us. Dion Brand talks about this door that constantly haunts us and imagining this door. I always think about this when I think about Abdul telling me about his experience in immigration detention. And as he sat in his cell in Lindsay, seeing the dates and names on the walls around him, and realizing that was the dates and names of people who had been deported. And he just imagined his name would go up on that wall next, which he experienced as a kind of writing on his tomb, like that this was his gravestone, and that, you know, his name going up was a form of like entombment. Many people who have experienced the deportation system alongside the criminal justice system, the so-called criminal justice system, often say the scars and traumas of the deportation linger even as they've healed from things like incarceration. It feels to many people like falling into an abyss, being sent to a place that you have no connection to, often that you've been forcibly removed from, a place often impacted by violence and war, stoked by places like Canada, who are active destabilizing African nations. You know, we are active through things like AFRICON, the Lima group in Haiti, the core group. You know, we are all around the world destabilizing people, creating refugees, and then claiming we welcome them, and then threatening to send people back to these places once we've destabilized and removed their resources. So I just remind us of that. Very briefly, because we are being quite depressing today, these are just some images from our campaign for Abdul. So just reminding us of the work we can do and did do and must continue to do as well, to stay for our comrades, to come for everybody, and to recognize that borders are an illegal separation. They do not fit with Indigenous ways of knowing the land. They run through Indigenous territories. They are illegitimate and illegal. Of course, capital can move across borders. No one has any problem with Walmart coming up or the Amazon Prime trucks I see all over my neighborhood. But if a poor person wants to come to work or to be safe, suddenly we control that. And of course, it's okay to use that labor as a nanny, as a fruit picker, as long as you won't stay in the country. With that said, I'm going to do a poem. It's not going to be a very good performance because, as you can hear, I sound terrible, but you guys can do the refrain along with me if you want. They sailed around the world until they hit Hispaniola. The Pope and Queen and banks all said, let roll the mighty dollar. Columbus and Cortez, they claim they were explorers. The borders crossed us. We never crossed the borders. Set up the encomendia system for the ones they called the Indians. Justified it all because they said their souls weren't Christians. Forced the tribe to work, stole the land acre by acre, took the people as a tribute, the resources and the labor. The ones they didn't murder, they took out with disease. 95% of the Americas murdered within the century. The Arawak, Taino, and Carib, they said that they were animals, enslaved and exterminated on the claim that they were cannibals. And when no one was left to work the land because they were all dead, they turned their eyes to Africa and said, enslave the blacks instead. So they sent their ships to prey upon West African shores, ironically guided by the maps that were taught them by the Moors. To the company of royal adventurers from the conquistadors, the borders crossed us. We never crossed the borders. They claimed they were too delicate to work out in the heat. So they said we didn't feel the pain because we were like beasts. They developed racist ideologies to say we were inferior, and so the color of our skin became their human criteria. And with letters from the queen, they bought and then they sold and stacked upon each other. They chained us in the hold. To work the land for sugar, they brought us across the sea, brutalized and murdered us, took us from our families. Saw us just like cattle so we could be exported. The average life, 10 years till we expired from the torture. A millennia of history and humanity they had to ignore. The borders crossed us. We never crossed the borders. And so we worked the fields for them, condemned because we were Black. And in Europe, they built cathedrals and museums from the wealth got off our backs. The developed world, they call it, the cradle of civilization, funded by the labor of forced African migration. Factories and manufacturing, banks, technology, and ports, the industrial revolution from the goods sent back and forth, and corporations and royal charters developed of all sorts. The borders crossed us. We never crossed the borders. So now 500 years later, they call themselves the first world nations. And now they got the nerve to say they're controlling immigration. And them that only ran into the Americas because they was lost, now say they define our movement and the spaces that we cross. And now brown and Black people from the global south to north have to pay to enter countries where once our movement here was forced. Trade in sex and labor is the modern slavery taken from the same people exploited through history. 1% of the population own 40% of the world's assets. Globalization should be called the continuation of the Middle Passage from the Hudson Bay Company to mass extermination. They take the lives from people, give the rights to corporations. Land, jobs, and resources, the people can't afford it. So parents leave their children just so they can support them. From nannies to fruit pickers, they make domestic labor laws, forcing movement of the people just like they did before. Taking rights over their bodies just because they're poor, lock workers into rooms, seize papers and passport, imprisoned, killed at checkpoints, exploited and deported. The borders crossed us. We never crossed the borders. And now from Jamaica, Guatemala, Philippines, and Mexico, the wretched of the earth still make the dollars flow. When half the world's workers labor for $1.25, the borders cross us. We never cross the border. Babies born in prison because their mothers are detained. Workers die on highways in vans where they are chained. Women raped and abused, but no one can report it. The borders cross us. We never cross the borders. Still working in the fields, still caring for the children. No citizenship, health, education, a standard of living. Come here for a season and then they are transported. The borders cross us. We never cross the borders. And the same people who through history have colonized the rest, continue to take the land and hoard up all the wealth, still living off the backs of everyone they slaughtered. The borders cross us. We never cross the borders. Still don't want to pay a living wage. Workers at their beck and call. Our bodies and our freedom, they want to own them all. Say we are illegal, but our history records the borders cross us. We never cross the borders. The borders crossed us. We never crossed the borders. Thank you, everybody. Sorry for my low energy and COVIDness. And thank you to all the speakers and for having me.
That seemed like a lot of energy to me.
Al, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's the brilliant Dr. Al Jones, poet, academic, activist, freedom fighter, currently with COVID, though you really cannot tell, but we wish you a speedy recovery, Al. Our final speaker this afternoon is Samer Miskati, who is joining us as the Associate Director of the Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. For folks who are tuning in, who aren't familiar with the hashtag Welcome to Canada campaign, this is work that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty are doing together to call attention to provincial government's continued partnership with the vile, inhumane institution known as CBSA, in the vile, inhumane institution known as Canada. So thank you so much to Samer for joining us. He is a lawyer, a documentary photographer, and a former journalist who has extensive experience monitoring and documenting human rights abuses, particularly during crises such as armed conflict, mass civilian displacement, and large-scale killings. Please give it up for Samer, who's going to tell us a little bit about this campaign and why it is essential that provincial governments end their partnership with CBSA.
Thank you, Meenakshi. Hello, everyone. As you can tell, I have the unenviable job of following Dr. L. Jones. That was such an incredible presentation. I'm still in that moment. Thank you. And also, I wanted to thank the organizers and all the rest of my fellow panelists for this really important event. I'm truly honored and humbled to be part of this teach-in. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credits, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. This territory is otherwise known by its colonial name as Toronto. I'd like to focus my remarks today on the lived experiences of people who were locked up in immigration detention and have generously shared their stories with us as part of a comprehensive joint report that we released with Amnesty International. But before that, I just wanted to say a few general comments about the inhumanity of the immigration detention industry in Canada. As many of you know, earlier this year, a person died while in immigration detention in Laval, Quebec. More than 3 months have passed now since this tragedy, and there are so many things we don't know. We still don't know this person's name, their age, whether they had a child or other family, where they were from, how long they were detained, or even how they died. It's astonishing that someone can die in the custody of a government agency and no one's allowed to know anything about them. But there are things that we do know. People in immigration detention across Canada are subjected to serious human rights violations. Since 2000, at least 16 people have died in immigration detention, mostly in provincial jails. The Canada Border Services Agency has a history of cloaking fatalities in secrecy and refusing to release basic information about those who die in custody and the cause of death. CBSA's extensive powers remain largely unchecked. As Dr. L. Jones just mentioned, it's the only major Canadian law enforcement agency without independent civilian oversight. And a defining feature of Canada's immigration detention system is that it inflicts cruelty and it dehumanizes people on such a scale that it no longer feels cruel or dehumanizing, especially to those perpetuating this industry. Over the past decade, Canada has incarcerated tens of thousands of people in immigration detention, including children and people who are seeking safety, people for whom Canada represents a hope and home. Many are forced to endure some of the most restrictive conditions of confinement, including maximum security provincial jails, and to do so without a countdown to a date of release. Not only are these violations of international human rights law, but they also have devastating effects on people's mental health. As you've already heard from my fellow speakers today, one of the most damaging aspects about the immigration detention system is that there is no limits to how long people can be deprived of their liberty. Many of the people we interviewed who experienced immigration detention firsthand told us that the uncertainty about how long detention would last was the defining feature of their experience. The notion that they just couldn't know when life would get back to normal, that uncertainty can shred every last bit of hope that people hold on to in immigration detention. This can create such an intense sense of powerlessness that many people in immigration detention contemplate taking their own lives. Another common theme from our interviews was the shock people felt at being detained, particularly in provincial jails. One of CBSA's most consequential powers within the immigration detention system is that the agency has full authority over where people are detained. Our research found that according to CBSA policy, the agency may incarcerate people with mental health conditions in provincial jails specifically because of their psychosocial disability. This is clearly discriminatory. CBSA representatives justify this practice by claiming that people have access to specialized care in provincial jails and that their behavior can be better managed in these facilities. Instead of receiving vital support, people with psychosocial disabilities are subjected to disproportionately coercive treatment in immigration detention. We've also spoken to people who expressed suicidal ideation while in detention, and in response, authorities put them in solitary confinement. The devastating impact of immigration detention can last for months and years, and the consequences can ripple to people's loved ones as well. The immigration detention system stands in stark contradiction to the image that many people around the world have of this country and of British Columbia as welcoming multicultural safe havens. There is a rich fabric of community-based organizations that provide tailored and compassionate support. But migrants and refugee claimants can't access these services while they are in jail. Instead, many people are re-traumatized before they could even begin their lives in Canada. In January of this year, the provincial BC government confirmed that it will review its immigration detention contract with the Canada Border Service Agency. The province has a real opportunity to stop the human rights violations that immigration detainees endure in the province's jails, and instead ensure that people seeking safety and a better life are treated with humanity and dignity. This is the first time any province has publicly agreed to review and reconsider this agreement because of human rights concerns. Should British Columbia do the right thing and cancel, the impact will reverberate across Canada. I'm also enthusiastic and excited about an upcoming motion at Vancouver City Council on June 7 that, if passed, will send a clear message to the province to cancel its immigration detention contract with CBSA. No other city in Canada has taken this step. Let me end by saying that I'm privileged and proud to be part of an amazing coalition of social justice, academic, and grassroots organizations, as well as individual lived experiences in immigration detention, and hundreds of lawyers, scholars, healthcare providers, and religious leaders across Canada calling for an end to this horrible practice. In the last 2 weeks, this coalition's campaign has publicly released a dozen submissions made to the province's review of its contract. It's time that BC's government listened. My plea to you today, please join us in our actions as we call on the City of Vancouver and the province of British Columbia to seize this historic opportunity and demonstrate that this is a place where newcomers are welcome and where human rights are foundational. There are 2 direct ways to support this campaign. You can write to BC's Premier John Horgan and share a Twitter message asking him to cancel BC's contract. You can do this through our campaign website at welcome2-canada.org, or you can write a letter or an email to a Vancouver City Councillor in support of the City Council motion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samir. And so we have two calls to action right there, and just a few other more calls to action. There's going to be links in the chat about the campaign to keep Suhail home. There is another link to support a family who was surveilled outside of school by the Canada Border Service Agency. The mother was dropped off her daughter in kindergarten and was followed by the Canada Border Service Agency and arrested in an alley nearby. So that's the Keep Adriana and Alberto Home campaign. That link's going to be in the chat. Another reminder, Meenakshi mentioned earlier, to buy Keon's chapbook with poems. Email info@defund604.com to get a copy. And support, and also to follow what Samir said about supporting the Welcome to Canada campaign. So abolish prisons, abolish borders, and we're going to have HK finish us off.
Yep, just going to play some HK. Thank you again to everyone who spoke and who joined us, from Manuel Axel Strain to Comrades Suhail, Keon, Ish, Dr. L. Jones, Samir from Human Rights Watch, to Omar from Defund 604, who is also a tireless organizer working in solidarity with migrants and folks without status. It's been a real pleasure to bring this teaching to you. And of course, abolishing CVSA in prisons is integral to the work of abolishing the police and defunding them into non-existence. So I'm really excited to finish this webinar with some more words from Higher Knowledge. Okay, technical difficulty with Higher Knowledge. Not sure why I can't play that, but we'll try and figure that out and also maybe just upload it to the YouTube page. And that is it for this afternoon's webinar. Thanks again to everyone who joined in. Stay tuned and do follow.
Thank you, everyone.
604. Bye, folks.
Thank you, everybody. Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Much love to the comrades. Bye, everybody. I was like blowing kisses, but no one could see me, so it probably sounded weird.
Bye, Farrell.
I felt them.